Let's go. Okay, next thing we're going to talk about is plagiarism and academic honesty. And so plagiarism is part of overall ethics. We're going to talk about ethics today in research. Plagiarism is a little piece of that, although we're going to talk about some really crazy stuff that people did under the guise of science that's wrong. And we'll talk about ethics in that way, but plagiarism is also part of acting ethically. You know, representing yourself honestly academically is part of being ethical. So here are some rules, and if you want to take a screenshot, you can do that, or write these things down, whatever. Don't quote from the article. That's a general rule. When you're writing papers for me, I don't know what you've done for other people, but I don't want quotations. I'd be happy with 0 if you really, really have to quote something to make your point really excellently. Then you can quote one time. I've seen too many papers that are a string of quotes and almost nothing else. And they are not compelling, they're not useful, and they're hard to understand. No quoting. Second, don't use more than 5 words in succession from the original article. If you use 5 words in a row from the original article, that counts as plagiarism. And that's what search engines are kind of keyed into looking for, is 5 words in a row. What is lifting parts of a paragraph and what's verbatim? So lifting is when you just take it from the paragraph straight out and you just drop it in. Quoting verbatim is word for word for word. Okay, so this is in your lab manual. If you look at labs 71, 72, and 73, this information is there. And so you read through those, and then you're going to apply this in lab 73. By practicing doing what is bad plagiarism and then practicing how to not plagiarize. It takes practice to figure out how to say things in your own words. So don't stress about it, just practice. That's all it is. It doesn't like drop out of the sky on you. It's a result of practicing it a few times, maybe more than a few times, okay? Plagiarism is considered academic dishonesty. And so you can't plagiarize and represent that work as your own and think that you're being honest. Just FYI, now you know. Sharing your answers with each other to quizzes or to like the final smackdown, etc., that is academic dishonesty. Sharing answers, asking people to share answers, looking up quiz answers online as you do the quiz. None of these are honest. So those are all a big no-no. And I have to report any instances of this to the provost's office. So please don't do that. It makes me sad, okay? All right, now we're gonna talk about ethics. Ethics are things you should have, things that everyone should have, but as you will see, some people didn't have them, and wow, bad. All right, in your book, it talks about the Belmont Report. I just wanna highlight that for you so you make sure that you know that section of the book where we talk about the 3 principles from the Belmont Report. The Belmont Report was a result of a meeting of people that happened because of some ethical violations. And so they thought, okay, what do we need to do to kind of create these principles that people need to go by so that we can have ethics in our research? One of them is respect for persons, one is beneficence, and one is justice. So make sure you understand what those things mean in the context of the Belmont Report. So if I ask you, what is justice? I don't mean what is justice in real life. I mean, what is justice in the context of the Belmont Report? One other way that we make sure that we're being ethical in our research is that we use an IRB, an Institutional Review Board. So every university has an IRB. And the persons or the people who run the IRB look at people's studies that are proposed and figure out if those studies are ethical. One of the requirements of being an ethical study is that it's a decent study, that it's put together well, that it's good quality research proposal. So you can't propose anything that's not very good and expect it to be called ethical, even if you're not breaking any ethical guidelines otherwise. It has to be decent research. You don't want to waste the time of participants. That is an ethical concern, is the volunteers in the research have to be protected so that we're not wasting their time. All right, so here are some links if you want to look at what the IRB at Southern Virginia University entails. Those are for you to check out and take a look at. They won't be on the quiz. You should just know that they're there. Here are a number of ethical issues that are brought up that I think it's important to just highlight again. Sometimes people think they are more ethical than they actually are. This is true in relationships too. You may have noticed some people think that they are more nice, more giving, more sacrificing in a relationship than they actually are. This is actually a very common illusion. Both people in a marriage can feel like they're giving 75%. That's probably about how it feels, but that's not how it is. And so the goal in marriage actually is sort of give 100% and then know that you're going to think the other person's doing less than you're doing, and that's normal. But they probably feel the same way. And you're probably both justified. You probably see things in ways where you think you're both right. Okay, fine. So you have an illusion that you're more sacrificing, more giving, working harder than you actually are. So that's an ethical illusion. It's a marital illusion too. All right. Fading. Ethical fading happens when you start to like move out of that ethical situation and look at it using other ideas. So in one of the things we'll talk about, the Tuskegee study, what happened were that people started really valuing this idea of doing an experiment at the expense of how the people who were involved in the experiment were being treated. And so they started overestimating the value of a really great experiment and seriously underestimating the value of people. Dangerous reward systems. So here's where you're looking at, I'm doing this study for the sake of humanity, right? Except it's really for the sake of you. You know, I'm going to publish some papers. People are going to look at me like, oh, wow, just amazing. Wow, check that out. That person's great. Look at that. Okay, so that's a dangerous reward system, pretending you're doing it for others when you're really doing it for you. And a lot of times we have motivated blindness. We can look at this in terms of the in-group versus out-group ideas. You know, you want to protect your in-group by kind of turning a blind eye to unethical behavior. And you want to criticize your out-groups by saying, no, look at that. Didn't you see that you did that? How can you be blind? We kind of tend to do that. But you want to make sure that you're looking for it as you're doing a study so that you see the unethical behavior, even if it's not in your best interest to see it. It's called being grown up and mature. It's hard to do. All right, so we're going to talk about Tuskegee. We're going to go in depth and expand a little bit on what that as compared to what's in your book. This is a big deal, this study, and it's horrible. It's horrifying what happened. Just horrifying. So let's dive into a little bit of being horrified. Right? Welcome to the first day of research class. Horrifying. Okay, that'll be awesome. All right, so the Tuskegee experiment, as you remember from your reading, was about black men with syphilis not being told they had syphilis and being observed for decades. And a lot of times it's easy to go back and look at something like that and go, oh, how could they? How could they? One thing to remember in terms of putting it into context is that lots of studies before this were also horrifying. It wasn't only the Tuskegee study. There were lots of horrifying things that had happened. And so this link, I'm going to let you look it up instead of wasting your time for me to read it to you. So you can pause, cut and paste, or just search under the next page before Tuskegee. Guatemala was an experiment that happened with the same guy who did Tuskegee. In Guatemala, what happened were there were soldiers and prostitutes who were given syphilis in really gruesome ways. I mean, gruesome. Like, don't read this before you eat. Like, oh, just wrong. There are a whole number of studies listed that were hair-raising, eyebrow-raising, wrong. And so when you look at Tuskegee, you have to look at it as part of a bunch of things that were not okay, not just one thing that was not okay. So here's some background in understanding this. Now, syphilis was a big problem at the time, and syphilis had been a problem for centuries at this point. people had tried a number of different ways to try and heal syphilis. All kinds of remedies had been tried. 1913, there was an experiment done in Oslo with untreated syphilis. So they had 2,000 people that were prevented from getting the remedy of the day, which was mercury. Now, mercury, I don't recommend. Mercury is poisonous, okay? But it does poison other things. It would knock out syphilis. It would also knock you out. You know, there are a number of people who have died from being given mercury as a cure for their illnesses, and they're dying from the cure. This has not gone away. So 2,000 people were not allowed to get, are not allowed to, wouldn't that be nice? We're not allowed to get mercury. 70% had no bad effects from the syphilis. Interesting. 28% of those had a spontaneous cure. Okay. 30% had bad effects, right? So you had 2,000 people, you said you can't have a cure, 30% of them, that was a really bad thing. And so that was what they were coming from. Was that, okay, here's this study. Are Black people different? I mean, those were all whites in Oslo. Maybe Blacks are different. I don't know why people thought that way. I can't tell you. It doesn't make sense to me. But that's what the thinking was. The thinking was legitimate, that there was some sort of difference happening. Okay, so what they did was the venereal disease section of the Public Health Service was really interested in helping Black people, helping everyone with syphilis. That was their whole deal. They wanted to prevent and treat it. They thought better science will lead to better treatment. And so let's make this beautiful study to result in better treatment. In fact, they were very open to having Black people as part of their communities, training them, hiring them more so than the average person. And so you can't say that the study was about all from people who were really prejudiced or had a lot of racism, because they were very much wanting to help Blacks and very much wanting them to be with them and part of their team. And you'll see that part of the people on the team for the Tuskegee study were Black. Some people were very racist, some people were not. The overall intention was not racist, but it didn't work. It didn't work at all. So here are some of the assumptions that were made that were wrong. One of them, though, was that medical professionals in general, not all of them, but in general, they really thought Black men would say no to treatment for syphilis, which was not accurate at all. But they assumed Black people wouldn't want to admit they have it, and they wouldn't want treatment. So that was a dumb assumption. Secondly, they thought, well, you can't tell that they have the disease anyway, so it's probably impossible to really treat it. I mean, you know, I think you're justifying a little bit. I think you're justifying. They didn't understand anything about, well, maybe they're too poor to be able to take the time off to go get the cure, et cetera. There are lots of other reasons other than, you can't just say, well, they just aren't interested. Okay, so that's one set of more understandings about that background. One sec here. Okay, another problem that people realized was very relevant was that since they wanted the progress of Black people, they wanted them to be more involved in jobs, in education and training. In general, this was the goal, was increasing health of the African American population. The idea that the assumption was that their syphilis rate was 35%. This was actually not accurate, because in a couple of places where they looked at it, it was 35%, but there were lots of places where it was much lower. And so, again, you had some people that were well-meaning, some people were not well-meaning, some people thought they were well-meaning, and they were dressing it up, like in some of those ethical kind of dilemmas we just had talked about. And so in the 1920s, what happened was they said, let's do this. Let's really do aggressive treatment, and let's eradicate this syphilis problem. And so here you go. Let's do mercury and bismuth. Okay. Poison. Don't do that, right? Don't do this at home, guys. So less than 30% of the people were cured. and there were fatal side effects. So obviously that did not work. And so they're thinking about, okay, what else can we do? Ended up with this Rosenwald charitable program. The Rosenwald program was originally supposed to promote education and health among poor Black farmers, which sounds like useful, right? Let's go make a difference. Let's go create some help. 1929 to 1931 is when this study happened. They wanted to identify the counties in the South with the highest rate of syphilis in Black males and then focus their target those counties so that they could try and get them the most treatment. The intention was, we're going to go identify who has the most syphilis, and then we're going to treat it. That was the original idea. But Rosenwald, actually, let me go back for a second. The Rosenwald charitable program, so if you remember what happened in 1929, we had the big crash, the Great Depression. Yeah, I hope that doesn't happen next year. But we had this big crash, and then there was the Great Depression, and the Rosenwald charitable program ran out of money and was no longer in charge of this idea that let's figure out where it's the worst and then go treat it. That was their original intention when they set up what eventually became the Tuskegee study. So at the time, terrible treatments were what existed. There wasn't good treatment for syphilis. You could do mercury and bismuth, which is poisonous. You could do arsenic. That sounds delicious. There's just like no treatment that really worked. No treatment often was better than some treatment, okay? So Rosenwald ended, there was no money, but the guy who was in charge of the Rosenwald report, Dr. Taliaferro Clark, okay? So just a cute little thing, Booker T. Washington, right? Booker T. Washington, if you don't know who that is, go look it up. You should know who Booker T. Washington is. The T in Booker T. Washington stands for Taliaferro or Taliaferro. Taliaferro, I just kind of looked this up because I was interested. They're interesting that there's that connection between these two men who are trying to advocate the cause of Blacks. And so Dr. Clark looked at Macon County. Macon County had a high rate of syphilis. It was one of those few counties that were chosen that did not really represent Blacks in general. High rate of syphilis, and most of the people didn't get treatment. Well, why did they not get treatment? It wasn't because they weren't interested. It was because they couldn't get it, okay? And this is the part that they failed to see. And so since they figured, well, since a lot of these people aren't getting treatment anyway, what a great opportunity to check out what happens when they're not treated. So you remember that Oslo study where they had people not be treated for their syphilis to see what happened? And then they said, well, these apply to white people, maybe they don't apply to black people. So here we've got Dr. Clark and colleagues saying, hey, it's like a naturalistic observation. They're not going to get treatment anyway. So let's just look at them. Let's just watch them and observe and see what happens. So the idea was we're going to do this for maybe a year, maybe 6 months, maybe 18 months, not long. We'll just observe for a little bit and then they'll all get treatment. Great. So then he retired. He retired after the first year. He was no longer there to make sure that the study ended and the people got treatment. And so what happened was originally they recruited about 400 Black men with latent syphilis and about 200 Black men without syphilis. And so they're going to kind of look at what happened. Many of these men had never seen a doctor. Most of them were very poor sharecroppers. What they were told was that they had bad blood. Now, bad blood was actually a common term for syphilis. And so it's not like they were being told something that was on purpose wrong. So when you said you have bad blood, people understood that to mean something like syphilis, sort of like we say many things today that we know what it means, but if you say, that I have the flu, you kind of know what that means. If you said I have bad blood, then people would go, okay, it's something like syphilis, or that is syphilis, right? So they weren't lying to them by not telling them. A lot of people I think overestimate the amount of bad things that happened. There were enough really, really bad things that happened. You don't need to make it worse than it actually was. It's kind of hard to make it worse. So anyway, what happened originally was that the Public Health Service asked the Tuskegee Institute to help run this study. So, well, let's do a research group. Let's study the effects of untreated syphilis on Black men. 6 to 9 months. Let's do it for 6 to 9 months. Then we'll come up with a treatment plan, and then we'll show people that treatment's needed. So see, a lot of times the intention was, let's help. We want to demonstrate how much we need treatment here. Like, we need to fund this treatment. That was the original plan. It kind of went wrong, right? Kind of went way off the rails. So in 1932, they went to follow up to see what happened. The plan was, 6-month study. You get periodic doctor visits. When you come in for your doctor visit, you get a free meal, you get burial insurance. And the doctor visits are treatment. Now, that's a lie, because they weren't. They were just looking at them, checking them. They weren't treating them. And in fact, they had done some spinal taps and called it treatment instead of just calling it, this is a spinal tap because we want your blood. Right? Tuskegee Institute wanted the credit. They wanted their Black professionals involved because they wanted the credit. Very pro-African American, and this was the Booker T. Washington connection. It was founded by Booker T. Washington. So what happened was that they were wrong about their assumptions. What we know is that the actual data show 20% prevalence, not 35%. Lots of previous treatment had actually happened in that county. And so this idea that 99% didn't have treatment, that was incorrect. This shows us the importance of doing the basics, laying the groundwork, making sure all your ducks are in a row, making sure that you have accurately surveyed the whole landscape of what you're trying to do, so that you're operating from correct assumptions or from correct facts and not incorrect assumptions. The other primary problem was that all these men wanted treatment. Nobody didn't want treatment. So this whole assumption that was made about, well, they don't want treatment anyway, that was completely wrong. So in fact, in order for them to show up to do the study, they were promised treatment. That's why they came. They had to be promised treatment in order to even participate. And so the deception that followed after the first year or two was the real tragedy here. That first year, I could see where you want to gather data for 6 months, 9 months. Okay. And then you ran out of money. And then things just sort of went off the rails at that point. The original people who did the study were not doing the study anymore. New people came in, and here's where one of the biggest problems was when who came in. So we had this guy named Moore. He's the one who said, in 1933, he wrote a textbook, and he said, syphilis can be treated. You should never, ever repeat this horrific Oslo study that had 2,000 people without any treatment, and 30% of them, of course, had terrible outcomes. But he also thought that the Tuskegee study was really unique and valuable because Blacks were different from whites in terms of how syphilis acted. Now, okay, whatever. Yeah, so I think he's wrong there, and we know that more now, but I just get frustrated because it's like, you've seen the meme with all the different skeletons. All these people are different, we're all the same inside. Yeah, okay. I get worked up a little every time I talk about this study. So then we have some scientists who are like all about science, and science are more important than people. This was another big problem. People who wanted the science more than they wanted to help the people in the study. And so the scientists continue this for the sake of science. They're like, oh, we have to do this because we'll never have another chance to see what happens with no treatment. Like, okay, yeah. Plus, Black men don't get treated anyway, right? So they're still clinging to this idea. And there's no really good treatments anyway. which was true at the beginning of the study in like 1929. There was really crappy treatment. But by 1940, in World War II, et cetera, in 1950, 1960, there was really much, much better treatment. We had penicillin. And so here's one of the really awful things that happened. When penicillin became the treatment of choice for syphilis, the study basically said, no, you can't get this. And here's egregious. What happened was that when some of these men enlisted in the army in World War II, they got in touch with, the study people got in touch with the military and asked for them to not offer these men penicillin treatment for their syphilis. I just see that as unbelievably wrong. Continued for decades. Let's just observe them. So, you could sort of justify what they were planning on doing in 1929. You can't justify this. And so part of it was different management, different people who were managing. In 1969, the CDC reviewed the study as it was and said, it's fine, continue with no treatment. So you got to wonder what was going on at the CDC that they would make that kind of a judgment. All right, so here's the study team from the 1950s. On the far left, you see Nurse Eunice Rivers. She was part of the study forever. She was like a real mainstay and really made a difference working, knew all the people, really kind of tried to make a difference for them and help them. Then we've got John Charles Cutler, who is possibly the most questionable person of all. His history involved a study of gonorrhea in Terre Haute in a prison where he gave prisoners gonorrhea. Then he's the one who went to Guatemala and looked at gonorrhea and syphilis in military and prostitutes and gave it to them to see what happened. I think we knew what happened by that point. I don't think that was necessary. It's really hard to figure out anything other than he's messed up to think that he can go force these people to have these diseases in gruesome, horrific ways. And then, so he's the one who came in and supervised the rest of the Tuskegee study. And then you start to say, oh, well, maybe that's part of why it went off the rails, because John Charles Cutler was in charge of it. What was going on? And there are a couple of quotations here. He took pains to keep its activities hidden from what one of the research described as goody organizations that might raise a lot of smoke. So he's hiding what he's doing. Obviously, he knows it's wrong. The problem in 1946, one of these guys said, was ethical rules were treated as obstacles to overcome, not as a bedrock of human dignity. And so Dr. Gutman was discussing what had happened as she gave the report to the bioethics committee. I think this was in the early 1970s when they finally stopped this study. But John Charles Cutler was a large part of why the study went off the rails so much and continued in ways that were so egregiously unethical. He certainly, certainly had a history of very unethical, like horrifying behavior. The national press is what stopped it. Like we said, the CDC approved it to keep going. But some people got in touch with press and outraged enough that the national press revealed it to the country. That's why the study was stopped, because of the press, not because of the CDC, not because of oversight, not because of medical schools, not because of anybody doing the right thing. The men who did this took power and ran with it in ways that were so unethical and so wrong. The study didn't stop until the press got involved. At that point, at least 28 of these men had died directly because of their syphilis, and perhaps 100 more had died as a consequence indirectly of syphilis. And then we've got the women and the children who were past it and who had gotten it from their husbands. And just awful, awful consequences. So Dr. Cutler, John Charles Cutler here, this man, talked about it in a documentary on PBS. He ended up at the University of Pennsylvania Medical School, and he ended up fairly respected. It's difficult to reconcile how that can happen. He said, yeah, some will die. It's in the interest of the total society. These men in Tuskegee helped us learn how to treat syphilis among Blacks. They were serving their race, which doesn't seem right to me. It doesn't seem like that's what happened. It was important that they were supposedly untreated, and it would be undesirable to go ahead and use large amounts of penicillin